Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. We return to the Horn of Africa. This time we'll be exploring the country of Somalia, which, like much of Africa, has been plagued by civil war, wars between their neighbors, ecological disasters, and again, the often overlooked role Western imperialism of the US, Britain, France, Canada, and even the Gulf states has played in the constant instability in the region, which is the Horn of Africa, and nations like Somalia are no stranger to this. So who better to help us understand Somalia? We are rejoined by Abayomi Azikiwe, who is the editor of the Pan-African Newswire. His writings on the African continent have been published in, of course, his own website, also Black Agenda Report, workersworld.org, News Ghana, Janata Weekly, globalresearch.ca, Hood Communism, and various other publications. And he's often invited to speak on outlets as diverse as Press TV, CGTN, Al Jazeera, WBI Pacifica, and many others. So first off, Abayomi, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, it's a real honor to have you. And so I'm looking forward to learning all about Somalia. So I'm going to actually combine questions 1 and 2 like this. And so what are some important facts and general information one should know about Somalia? And after that, question number 2 is, what was Somalia's history before the Cold War, and then when colonialism was restructured into, some people would say imperialism, other people would say neocolonialism, and that is the Cold War era. Talk to us about how Somalia was impacted, by this.
Many of the people who claim Somalian origin say that the Somali people have been divided into 5 different nation states. This is during the post-colonial era because they were colonized by France, by Britain, by Italy. There's also a large Somali population in Ethiopia as well as in Kenya. So many of the Somalian nationalists, if you want to use that term, often talk about reuniting Somalians who have been dispersed in these various nation states as a direct result of colonialism in the 19th century. So that's very important for people to understand. But today, what is known as Somalia is still a fractured state. If you look, you have breakaway areas such as Somaliland and Puntland in the north of Somalia, which does not identify with the central government in Mogadishu and tend to have more of a peaceful social situation than what is considered Somalia today, the center of Somalia. Now, the people in Mogadishu, of course, want to reunite with Puntland and Somaliland. However, the problems continue, and a lot of the problems are directly related to the history of colonialism in the Horn of Africa. So people have to start from that vantage point.
Interesting. And what now? What was Somalia like? What kind of a state was Somalia during the Cold War? Because the last time we talked about Ethiopia 2 weeks ago, and how the U.S., when they lost an ally in Ethiopia after the fall of Emperor Haile Selassie and the far left Derg came into power, a war had broken out between the Derg, which was backed by the USSR and Cuba, and Somalia, which was backed by the U.S. and its allies. So what was the leadership in Somalia like under that time, and how did that conflict and how did that conflict end, and what were the impacts of Somalia when that war between Ethiopia ended?
Well, it's important to go back to 1969 when there was a military coup that was socialist oriented in Somalia, which took a left-wing position, anti-imperialist position. And even 5 years after that, in 1974, there was the Mogadishu Declaration. People can look that up. It's a very progressive, revolutionary, anti-imperialist document that was issued right after the Sixth Pan-African Congress that was held in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Now, they maintained during that time period, the government of Muhammad Siad Barre, that they were in line with the socialist world, that they wanted to build Somalia into a socialist state. However, as time went on, the government of Siad Barre moved further to the right. And as we talked about before, in the late 1970s, they made a bid to reunite the Ogaden region in Ethiopia, which has a majority Somalian population, with the government in Mogadishu. The situation became so tense that open warfare erupted. And at that time, the Provisional Military Administrative Council, the DERG, was in power, and it erupted into a war which pitted the Ethiopian military against the Somalian military. And as I mentioned before, there was an intervention,
which had a radical left orientation, but then pivoted to the right, and that's why they were backed by the U.S. and the U.S. and their former colonizers. If we talk about France, if we talk about Britain, if we talk about Italy, then
yes. And at that time, President Jimmy Carter was in office at the White House, and this is right after the collapse of the U.S. imperial project in Southeast Asia. Of course, April 30th, 1975, the historic day where Vietnam was liberated and reunited. And then, of course, we had the walking away by U.S. imperialism from Cambodia and Laos as well. Also in 1975, you had the civil war in Angola over who was going to control liberated Angola. The MPLA had been supported by the socialist countries, particularly the Soviet Union and Cuba. They also had garnered the support of the progressive governments, socialist-oriented governments in Africa as well. So, and they had mass support among people across the African continent. So they were defeated. The pro-U.S. forces of UNITA and the FNLA, which was headed by Holden Roberto, that was the Front for the National Liberation of Angola, which was based in the then Zaire, which was under the control of Mobutu Sese Seko. In fact, it was rumored at the time that Holden Roberto was a CIA operative. He was head of the FNLA, and that he was married to Mobutu's sister. This is what was said during that particular time period. But the FNLA was defeated, and UNITA was beaten back to the southern part of Angola. So you had a situation where the United States had been defeated in Southeast Asia. They had been defeated in Angola. You had the armed struggles in Zimbabwe and Namibia that were escalating during that time period. Also, Mozambique gained its independence in 1975, and the year before, Guinea-Bissau had gained its independence. So the Carter administration was very reluctant in the late 1970s to commit U.S. troops to another war in Africa or anywhere else in the so-called developing world. So what happened was that they encouraged the Siad Barre regime to launch this war against Ethiopia, thinking that it would cause disruption to the Ethiopian government and embarrass the Soviet Union and Cuba. That was not the case. In fact, the Somalian army was defeated, horribly defeated, and this, of course, triggered other destabilization within Somalia, which eventually led to a full-blown breakdown of the Siad Barre government and a full-blown civil war that lasted from the period of the early 1980s all the way to the early 1990s. So these are some of the dynamics that were involved. So you had a move to the right on the part of Somalia, and of course that did not ensure that they would be able to enhance their territorial designs on areas within Ethiopia. So that is a snapshot of what was going on during the period between 1969 and, of course, the period of the early 1980s, when you had almost complete breakdown of the Somalian state, which was at that time under a military regime.
Interesting. And the right-wing military regime at that, right?
Yeah, it became extremely right-wing in regard to repression of its own people, the abandonment of the anti-imperialist struggle, and also the attack on neighboring Ethiopia. Fidel Castro, who was the leader of Cuba at that time, had put forward a proposal during the late 1970s for a unification campaign between Somalia, Ethiopia, and southern Yemen. Southern Yemen at the time was a left-wing, socialist-oriented state. Of course, that broke down as well in the early 1990s. So that did not work. It did not materialize. And you had this constant hostility between Somalia and Ethiopia, which in many ways still exists today on some level.
Wow, fascinating. And that's actually a perfect segue to Somalia in the 90s. Now, what was happening in the country in the 90s and what led to the infamous Black Hawk Down incident, which in the popular imagination was told in a huge Hollywood movie directed by Ridley Scott. And actually, let me read how they explain the movie. The plot explanation to that film on Rotten Tomatoes is the following. The film takes place in 1993 when the U.S. sent special forces into Somalia to destabilize the government and bring food and humanitarian aid to the starving population, using Black Hawk helicopters to lower the soldiers onto the ground. An unexpected attack by Somali forces brings two of the helicopters down immediately. From there, the U.S. soldiers must struggle to regain their balance while enduring heavy gunfire. An audience reviewer of Black Hawk Down typed the following on Rotten Tomatoes. Based on the true story of U.S. soldiers on a mission to capture lieutenants of a drug lord in Somalia, when a Black Hawk Down helicopter is shot down and they must battle a large Somali militia. So explain, what was the real story behind what is historically known as the Battle of Mogadishu and the Black Hawk Down incident, and if there's anything that you think needs to be challenged from that film, and as well as corporate state media in the West, please go right ahead and challenge away.
Yeah, well, the United States, as I mentioned, I believe in our previous discussion, has designs and have had designs going back decades on the Somalian oil reserves, which exist in abundance, but they have not been fully exploited. And it's not just the United States. The Canadian Oil Corporation also has designs on those oil resources. But to go back to the period of the early 1990s, you had a full-blown civil war between various factions in Somalia, and Siad Barre left the scene. And by 1992, there was a famine inside the country. So President at that time, George H.W. Bush Sr., ordered 12,000 U.S. Marines. They weren't just special forces. There were Marines that went into Somalia in December of 1992, which was 31 years ago. And they went under the guise that they were going to provide humanitarian assistance to the Somalian people to combat the famine. It was a whole public relations campaign. They were distributing toys to Somalian children. They were there to provide water, food, medicines, and so forth. Well, that went on for a few months, but it became obvious that they were there to repress the Somalian people and to remake Somalia into the image of U.S. imperialism. So by the spring and summer of 1993, Somalians began to organize and fight back. The United States, in July of 1993, bombed a meeting of Somalian elders in the capital of Mogadishu, killing well over 50 people. And this inflamed passions within Somalia. And of course, after that happened, there was the Somalian National Alliance came to the fore, and they led a struggle for the removal of both the United States as well as the United Nations forces, which had preceded the United States from Somalia. And there were battles that waged for several months. The highlight of it was in October of 1993, when there was a clash in the capital of Mogadishu where numerous U.S. troops were killed, and a lot of Somalians were killed as well. And they could not cover up those losses on the part of the U.S. troops. By this time, President Bill Clinton had taken office, and he was forced to address the question in Somalia. He wanted to maintain the status quo that George Bush Sr. had put in place several months before. But with all the casualties that were going on, and the fact that George Bush Sr. had waged the first Iraq war, supposedly to remove Iraq from Kuwait, he thought that that would ensure his reelection in 1992. But there was an economic downturn in 91 and 92 as a result of the defense spending on the first Iraq war. And he wound up losing the elections because a man named Ross Perot, who was a billionaire from Texas, formed another political campaign that won 19% of the popular vote. So Bill Clinton, in essence, won by default. Many people believe that if Ross Perot had not entered the election, that George Bush Sr. perhaps would have had a second term. So Clinton did not want to create a situation where he himself would lose in 1996 because of a war where the United States could not identify any formidable victory. So after the so-called Black Hawk Down situation, I believe that was on October 3rd of 1993, they began to debate the whole question of U.S. military intervention in Somalia. More and more people began to speak out against it on the left as well as the right inside the United States. So they announced just several weeks later they will begin their withdrawal from Somalia. So that's what happened by the early months of 1994. And the United Nations also withdrew from Somalia at that time. So that was a major defeat for U.S. imperialism in 1993 and in 1994 under the Clinton administration.
And wasn't one of the reasons why, the Somali forces shot down the helicopter, the Black Hawk helicopter, was because you had mentioned that under George H.W. Bush, special U.S. forces, which claimed that they were providing humanitarian aid and whatnot, were actually engaging in imperial activities. And you mentioned when the Somalians were trying to make peace with one another and unite to get the U.S. and other forces out of Somalia, there was that there was a massacre, that there was a massacre. So wasn't that actually the reason why when Clinton sent troops into Somalia, that was one of the reasons why they had shot the helicopter down? And also, isn't it also safe to say that Clinton, when he sent U.S. troops, it was under the guise of humanitarian aid, when really they were just going to be continuing more imperialism? So the Somali forces, just decided, okay, we need to send them a strong message, and that led to the bloody shootout. And I believe one of the characters in the movie Black Hawk Down, played by one of the Hollywood actors, either Ewan McGregor, he was actually one of those U.S. soldiers that engaged in horrific human rights abuses of Somalia. Hence why, again, the Somali forces, they weren't these degenerate monsters that just wanted to massacre a bunch of white saviors. No, it was because you've done this to our people and we don't trust you, and ergo the Battle of Mogadishu broke out.
Yeah, well, what happened was in November of 1992, there was the runoff election in the United States where George H.W. Bush Sr. lost, all right? The next month, even after he lost the elections, the next month, he sent in Marines to Somalia. Just think about that. This is why it's somewhat confusing that you have a president who was engaged in a war earlier the previous year in Iraq, that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. The following year, after he loses the election, he sends 12,000 Marines into Somalia. So Clinton takes over the following month in January of 1993. And of course, they're still operating under this facade that this is a humanitarian mission to Somalia. We only have goodwill for the Somalian people and so forth. But they start harassing Somalian youth. They started to throw their weight around inside of Mogadishu and other areas of the country. And as a result of that, clashes erupt, led principally by the Somali National Alliance that was headed by a man named Mohammed Farah Adi. Now, on July 12th of 1993, this is 6 months, almost 6 months after Clinton has taken office, the U.S. Military bombs a meeting of Somalian leaders, elders in Mogadishu, killing dozens of people. So the situation was already tense. There were already clashes taking place. This made it worse. So nearly 3 months later, you have this major clash in the capital of Mogadishu on October 3rd of 1993, where all these U.S. Marines were killed. They were humiliated. They were drugged through the streets by Somalian youth, and the helicopters were taken down and so forth. And when people in the United States saw this, and people around the world witnessed this, they immediately began to call for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Somalia. Now, people like myself, for example, were opposed from the beginning to the intervention in December of 1992. There is no positive or humanitarian intervention as far as U.S. imperialism is concerned. All of their interventions going back to the 19th century have all been designed for imperialist aims and objectives. So what happened in 1992 under George Bush Sr. was really no different than what we've seen in Haiti, what we saw the year before in Iraq, what we saw in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, what we saw in Dominican Republic in 1965, the overthrow of governments like in Ghana in 1966, Iran in 1953, and so forth. All of their military interventions, whether they're outright occupations or destabilization efforts, are all designed to strengthen U.S. and world imperialism. So it was no different in Somalia in 1992 and in 1993. But this really shook up the populace inside the United States, and they immediately were favorable for U.S. withdrawal. That withdrawal took place in 1994. However, that was not the end of the story. The U.S. continued to engage in interventionist activities in Somalia, and by 2006, they were at it again, this time using surrogates, and then the government in Ethiopia, which was under the Ethiopian, the Tigray People's Liberation Front government, which was the EPRDF government in Ethiopia, which sent troops into Somalia beginning in late 2006. Kenya soon followed. And of course, that process is ongoing today. We're talking about 16, 17 years later. There's still instability in Somalia.
That's that's a perfect segue to this question then, which is, when one thinks of Somalia, they think constant chaos and they think of total anarchy. And when one thinks of Somalia, they of course they believe that there is no strong central government. Each place is controlled by a warlord of sorts, and there's just always constant fighting going on between each place. However, it did look as though all of that was coming to an end with the rise of the, I believe they were called the Islamic Courts Union.
Yeah.
And during the George W. Bush era, the war on terror or the war on Islamic terrorism, if one was watching corporate media and Western state media, it sounded as if an Al-Qaeda, Taliban, or a pre-ISIS type of group had taken over Somalia. The West intervened to eradicate the Islamic Courts Union. So what happened during that time? And was there any half-truths to the claim about the Islamic Courts Union? And if none, then do explain what was the hidden suppressed truth going on with the rise of them and the West's efforts to overthrow them.
Yeah, that was a serious attempt in 2006 by various organizations in Somalia to bring the various factions together. And the process was moving forward on a very positive level. In fact, the United Nations even put out a film, which I still have a copy of, which talked about the efforts of the Islamic courts in trying to build unity and stability in Somalia. Well, this unity and stability was not in support of the U.S. position in the Horn of Africa. They wanted an independent position that would distance them from the United States. And of course, this was unacceptable to the administration of George W. Bush Jr., who had taken over in a very
Father like
controversial
son,
election.
evil always runs. Evil always continues.
Yeah, the son of a CIA director and longtime CIA operative, oil magnate, and who was a veteran of World War II, whose son dodged going to war in Vietnam and was a part of the National Guard, and his presence for duty was highly questionable. But the 2000 election, which was very controversial, and many people felt that it was the U.S. Supreme Court which decided who was the president, who was to be inaugurated as president in 2001. And of course, it was George W. Bush Jr., who, of course, won more electoral votes because of the swinging of the votes in Florida. But Gore had far more popular votes than Bush did. But that whole election process was very controversial after November of 2000, leading, of course, to much consternation. And many people never really recognized George W. Bush as a legitimate president.
As my hero George Carlin would say, you know, I only call him Governor Bush because that's the last elected office he was actually elected to.
Right. Yes. And then, of course, in 2001, there was the 9/11 with the Pentagon and the World Trade Center attacks. And then, of course, the response of the Bush administration and the U.S. Congress was, in essence, to declare war on the world. They sent troops into Afghanistan. And soon after that, they were making preparations for an invasion and occupation of Iraq. And they had other countries on their list as well. So it was a war-oriented series of administrations. If you go back to the first Bush administration with the war on Iraq, and then, of course, Clinton, who maintained the sanctions against Iraq, the UN sanctions that were drafted by the United States that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children who didn't have food, who medical equipment was denied to them, and many people died. And also the use of various weapons too, which caused disease and long-term ailments.
Yeah, depleted uranium.
Yeah, depleted uranium weapons and other type of weapons that were utilized that caused the death of hundreds of thousands of people. And they justified this, even under the Clinton administration, saying that it was worth the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in order to contain the government of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party in Iraq. So all these things were going on during the 1990s. And of course, Bush began to engage in airstrikes against Somalia after he had encouraged and provided incentives for Ethiopia and Kenya to intervene in the country. So both the United States and Britain engaged in airstrikes beginning in 2006 and 2007 in Somalia under the guise of fighting terrorism. Of course, the Islamic Courts Union eventually transformed itself into other organizations. We wound up with Al-Shabaab a year or two later, which is an Arabic word which means the youth. And Al-Shabaab had fought U.S. influence inside the country, but then it had a split between forces that were loyal to Al-Qaeda, and others later loyal to the Islamic State, so-called Islamic State. And some of the elders who had been involved in the Islamic Courts Union left the organization and went back and joined the political structures that existed in Somalia. So since that time period, we're talking about 2006, 2007, Somalia has undergone several famines. There's still huge food deficits inside the country. And the African Union mission to Somalia, which evolved out of the military intervention of Ethiopia and Kenya, brought in other countries to participate in the entire process. For example, Uganda and Burundi. And after all these years, war fatigue has clearly set in. So they transformed the African Union mission to Somalia, AMISOM, into the African Union Transitional Mission in Somalia, which mean, theoretically anyway, is to train the Somalian National Army so they can provide security for the Somalian state. That supposedly is under wraps right now, but if you look at it objectively, there's still fighting that's going on inside the country, even though the government is saying that they have been able to rescue many people from the control of Al-Shabaab. And at the same time, they're saying that they want to stabilize the country. Just recently, in fact, last week, the United Nations lifted an arms embargo against Somalia. So they can go on the international market now legally and purchase weapons from arms manufacturers to fight against the insurgent groups that are still operating in Somalia. Who knows what's going to happen there over the next few months and the next few years, because until there's some type of political settlement inside the country, if possible, that is the only real solution to stabilizing the situation in Somalia. So when you talk about how people view Somalia as a lawless state, as a failed state, and so forth, we always have to go back to the origins of the crisis, which is the division of the Somalian people under colonialism, and also the consistent intervention by the United States and other imperialist countries in the internal affairs of Somalia, which has taken place now for many decades.
And a quick follow-up question about the Islamic Courts Union. Was there any truth that they were some kind of a regressive Islamic political party, or were they, or was that just propaganda to demonize them? I'm curious your response on that.
Yeah, it was a variety of different tendencies within Somalia that had come together for that particular political project. It was never able to reach its fruition because of the interference, particularly by the Bush administration inside the United States. So we really don't know. It may have been able to evolve into a progressive organization, even though it has Islamic, very strong Islamic tendencies. We've seen other movements around the world that have Islamic orientation that now are leading anti-imperialist struggles, particularly in West Asia, for example. I mean, we see groups like Hamas, the Hezbollah, the Ansarullah in Yemen, the Islamic resistance groups in Iraq and Syria. So under the right conditions, these groups can be transformed into revolutionary organizations.
Interesting. And you already mentioned that Al-Shabaab was not out actually. So remind me again. So Al-Shabaab, was it an outgrowth of the Islamic Courts Union?
Yes, it was. Okay. It was a youth wing.
So it was an outgrowth. Okay, so it was an outgrowth of the Islamic Courts Union, but were a lot of the. So would you say that Al-Shabaab, is there any truth that they were a radical reactionary Islamic extremist group? And did many of the Al-Shabaab members, did they come from the Islamic death squads that existed in Libya after the murder of Gaddafi, as well as ISIS in Syria and Iraq, which was exported by the Gulf states, and which was exported by the Gulf states with full knowledge of the West.
Yeah, it clearly appears after several years of the struggle against the U.S.-backed government that they, in fact, some openly declared that they had allied themselves with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And of course, we know the origins of Al-Qaeda and ISIS are clearly within United States intelligence. Al-Qaeda, of course, going back to the U.S. campaign against Soviet alignment in Afghanistan, and ISIS, of course, arose in efforts to contain the Islamic Republic of Iran and its allies in West Asia. And they have been utilized, groups of that character have been utilized, particularly in Libya, when the government there was destroyed in 2011, and of course in Syria as well, which the so-called civil war erupted there in 2011 and 2012. And those groups fought essentially on the side of US imperialism. They were not fighting to end Zionism or end US imperialism. They were attempting to take over those countries with the support of US imperialism and other NATO states. So yes, I think Al-Shabaab went in that direction. And as a result of that, they have engaged in a war which has been quite detrimental to the civilian population in Somalia. And they have had support, particularly within the area of trade, the charcoal trade in the southern part of the country with some of the Gulf states. That was brought out several years ago. At this point, it's not clear exactly where they're getting their support from, but it appears from the reports that have been coming out recently that the government now in Somalia are attempting to contain the control that exists among the Al-Shabaab forces in various parts of Somalia.
And talk to us a bit more about Kenya's role in Somalia, because now, why do we often see so many Somali-related terrorist attacks on Kenya? The Kenyans I've spoken to, or the Kenyans I know on social media, they say that it's not fair that their country is being targeted, and again by Somali-related terrorists, and again the media. If you watch corporate Western state media, even some of the best international outlets which do cover African affairs, they often completely overlook the fact, and it is a fact, that Kenya has basically been a Western proxy for Western imperialism in Somalia. So explain to our audience that whatever Somali-related attacks that happens in Kenya, that's blowback because of Kenya's role in being basically a proxy for Western imperialism.
Yeah, there've been a number of attacks by Al-Shabaab in Kenya. One at a hotel several years ago that killed dozens of people. There've been attacks on other installations in Kenya. Kenya is the largest economy in East Africa. And they also have very close ties with the United States, military ties with the United States, Britain, as well as the state of Israel. There are many Israelis who own businesses in Kenya, and a lot of them also are involved in the tourism industry in Kenya as well. So this is the reality of the situation. And of course, this has happened throughout successive administrations in Kenya. And as I mentioned earlier, they did go into Somalia. They claim it was a defensive move because the Islamic Court Unions was a threat to their own national security. And I'd asked a diplomat from Kenya that question way back in 2007, and he could not clarify to me why the Islamic Court Unions were a threat to the national security of Kenya. And he said, well, they said they should take over Kenya too because we have Somalians, a large Somalian population. But I never heard that coming from the ICU during that particular time period. So yes, Kenya is a major source of US intervention in East Africa. And unfortunately, the role that they could play being the largest economy in East Africa and being so centrally located, is hampered by their ongoing ties with the United States. And that is unfortunate, but that is the situation that we faced not only in East Africa, but throughout various parts of Africa. That if you look at and see what's happening in West Africa right now, where people are trying to break, even through the military, trying to break with French influence and eventually American influence, it's a similar situation in East Africa as well.
So interesting. So what Kenya does in Somalia is very much related to what Uganda does with its Rwanda with its sort of de facto Rwandan proxies in my mother's country of the Congo DRC, or Congo Zaire, right?
Yes, and we know that the situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo remains unstable. And Rwanda, has an organization that it works with there called M23, at least one. And that group has been accused of committing atrocities against civilian populations in the Eastern DRC. And also, the government there has asked, just today or yesterday, I heard a report that the government of President Felix Tshisekedi had asked for even the East African Community Peacekeeping Force to leave the DRC. And elections are coming up very soon in the DRC. So it's very interesting that he would be asking even the East African peacekeeping forces to leave the country just leading up to an election, a major election that's going to determine the future of the country.
One of these days, we actually should be talking about how African peacekeeping troops, whether it's UN or African Reunion related, actually are just another proxy for Western imperialism. But we'll have to say that for another day. I have to ask then this question, which is, what are the reasons we see so much pirates coming from Somalia? And that, this is often, again, reported in the dominant media. And what at a global level can be done to address this crisis? And even if, so what can be done at a global level to end this crisis? And even if it doesn't stop the crisis entirely, we at least would see a huge decrease in piracy activity coming from Somalia.
Well, it's interesting you should ask that question because a week and a half ago, the U.S. had made allegations that people in Yemen were seizing vessels from Israeli-linked vessels and also vessels that had ties with the United States. Now, that has been happening. They've openly admitted that as long as the war against the people in Gaza continues, they will continue to attack.
We're talking about the Houthi forces in Yemen.
Yes, the Ansar Allah forces, which control large swaths of territory in Yemen. They said they're going to continue to attack these vessels as long as the hostilities continue against the Palestinians in Gaza. So they accused the Yemeni resistance forces of a particular attack on a vessel, a commercial vessel in the Gulf of Aden. The Yemeni resistance denied that, and eventually the United States had to agree with them, and they accused the piracy that had been prevalent in Somalia many years before for this incident. Now, I don't believe that. The Yemeni resistance wrote articles saying they didn't believe it either. And what the situation is, and I looked this up, the rate of piracy off the coast of Somalia has declined almost to a level of insignificance over the years. If you look at the actual data on it, there's almost no piracy right now taking place off the coast of Somalia. So that was just perhaps a false flag operation to later justify a deeper and larger U.S. naval presence in the Gulf of Aden, in the Red Sea area, in order to shore up the state of Israel in regard to their campaign of genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza and also in the West Bank as well. So no, there's no basis for that. there was a serious issue of Somali piracy that took place under the Obama administration after 2009. They killed some people who were claimed to be pirates. They arrested one young man and brought him back to the United States to put him on trial for being involved in piracy against commercial vehicles in the Gulf of Aden. But no, that problem, for whatever reason, has precipitously declined in recent years.
And I
They,
think is it safe to say that if there was a okay, so there was like a brief there was a brief
yes,
period of piracy going on, but
they
if there
claimed
was
that it was
piracy,
justified. The Somalians claimed it was justified because their country had been destabilized. The state had been largely destroyed. So this was their effort to protect interests, Somalian interests, off the coast of the Somalia nation.
so it's safe to say that if piracy was to erupt again in Somalia, what the international community can do is maybe stop, being imperialist towards
Yes.
Somalia. Enough with the divide and conquer. Enough with deliberately trying to undermine any kind of stability that exists. Try to respect the sovereign. Well, not try to respect. Do respect whatever
Right.
sovereignty does come out of Somalia, and then and of course this goes into a whole Marxist argument. But if we didn't have this awful neo-colonial imperial system, cough capitalism, then we wouldn't see the kind of incidents that occurred in Somalia, right?
Yeah, it's good you mentioned that because NATO, as well as the European Union, both naval forces, both had a strong presence. They upped their presence in the Gulf of Aden during that time period. So it became a NATO project, ostensibly, to fight piracy off the coast of Somalia. But you also have piracy as well in West Africa, in the Gulf of Guinea as well, which is probably more of a problem now than it is in the Gulf of Aden.
Interesting. That's fascinating. And then my second to last question is how much, I mean, you've already talked about this, but talk to us a bit more about this, which is how much of Western efforts to divide and conquer Ethiopia with Western support for the Tigrayan separatists that we see, the constant sanctions on Eritrea, the many Western military bases in Djibouti, and whatever the West is doing in Somaliland, how much of that is related to Western efforts to keep Somalia a place of constant chaos, because it's to the West's advantage to keep the Horn of Africa, as well as the entire continent, unstable, so the West can constantly exploit the situation they play a part in manufacturing to contain global hegemony, the imperial order.
Yes, that's essentially it. That it provides a raison d'etre, reason for the United States to intervene in the Horn of Africa, in the Gulf of Aden, in West Asia, in the Persian Gulf. If you have all these divisions that are taking place, then of course they can justify, or at least attempt to justify to the people in the United States, why they have to send naval forces to the from the Eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Gulf of Aden to protect U.S. interests, to fight against terrorism, and so forth. But what's really needed is a strengthening of the African Union. That is essential in bringing about an end to all these divisions. If that could take place, then the U.S. would not have room to maneuver. For example, the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, African Union needs to take a clear position against AFRICOMs operating at all on the African continent. They denied the right of AFRICOM to set up a base on the African continent. But at the same time, if you look at Djibouti, they have Camp Lemonnier, which is a French and U.S. Military base, and they have several thousand U.S. troops that are stationed there, and they use it as a staging ground for carrying out bombing operations against Somalia and anywhere else they want to bomb, which of course they can say is protecting the rights and the interests of the United States. For example, in Iraq, in northern Iraq recently, they killed 5 people who they claim were part of a Iraqi resistance organization. This happened just several days ago because the Iraqi resistance forces have been firing on U.S. military bases in Iraq. Now, when this was reported in the U.S. news, they don't ask why are U.S. troops still stationed in Iraq? Why are U.S. troops
Not only
stationed in
that,
Syria?
but not only that, but after the U.S. During the Trump administration, after they murdered General
Suleiman, yeah.
Yes, the very famous noble general of Iran. After the Trump administration had murdered this this popular general, the Iraqi parliament voted unanimously that they wanted all foreign troops out of Iraq, and yet the U.S. and Britain can still arrogantly say, no, we're not leaving Iraq.
Someone else's country. They also killed the head of the Popular Mobilization Units, the PMUs, which is a collective of Iraqi resistance groups that want U.S. imperialism out of Iraq and the entire West Asia region. So, yes, this was Trump who involved himself in a targeted assassination. This was almost 4 years ago. And still, this has not endeared the U.S. imperialists to the people of the region. In fact, they become even more isolated and more alienated from the majority of people in the West Asia region. So this will continue as long as they continue their support for the state of Israel and for the maintenance of U.S. military forces in Iraq and in Syria.
And also important to know that Israel actually is no friend to Africa. Israel has also played a junior partner role in Anglo-American imperialism, pan-Euro imperialism in the continent of Africa with, Israel, props up, continues to prop up the repressive government of Paul Kagame. Israel supports Youri Museveni in Uganda. Israel overthrew Patrice Lumumba and propped up Mobutu and has been involved in the constant destabilization efforts in Congo. So yes, Israel is no friend to
so they were allied
and also supported outside South Africa. So
yeah, they of course participated in the building of nuclear capability in South Africa under the apartheid system. There was a long time alliance between Zionism and the proponents of apartheid in Southern Africa.
So my last question then I have to ask is, what do you see the future for Somalia? What can Western audience and people globally do if they want to be a true friend to Somalia when it comes to the anti-imperialist movement, anti-war activism, and demands that their whatever country those people might be from, but demands that their nation stop being stop being an imperial partner or even a leading imperialist in Somalia?
Yeah, I think the anti-war movement, the peace movement in the United States, in Canada, have to be concerned about U.S. imperialist intervention in Africa, that they have to oppose any military involvement in Somalia, in Ethiopia, because in order to allow these countries to develop their own political and military situations, they have to have the freedom and the sovereignty to carry out what is necessary for the people inside their own particular nation states. And also the African Union has to play a role in this because the US as well as Israel is constantly attempting to interfere in the affairs of the African Union. We saw where the African Union Commission chair last year attempted to seat the Israeli ambassador at an African Union summit in defiance of the current suspension of the rogue appointment of Israel to have observer status in the African Union. That was done by the African Union Commission chair, Mr. Mahatmat. He was scolded for that. And of course, they had to suspend that decision. But no final decision, as far as I know, has been made on that question, although Israel has stayed away. The last time they attempted to come and be seated at an African Union summit, they were rejected physically. Now, the Israeli government blamed the Republic of South Africa, the ANC government, for that. But other than South Africa, there are other governments just as equally opposed. For example, Algeria, Namibia, Zimbabwe, all support the Palestinian struggle. And it's interesting that there was a conference held just 2 weeks ago in South Africa, a world conference in solidarity with Palestine. So I think their solidarity with the Palestinian people is unwavering. All the progressive forces in Africa are clearly committed to the liberation of Palestine. Of course, there are reactionary forces, there are opportunist forces that take money from the state of Israel, who have signed agreements with the state of Israel. But at this point, it's very difficult for them to come out publicly and state any support for Israel in light of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians and in light of all the other problems in the region. For example, in southern Lebanon, there's been clashes that have been taking place over the last 2 months between the Hezbollah and other resistance militias and the Israeli Defense Forces. So at this point, Israel is on the defensive, and we can see that clearly in the United States. They're even attacking university presidents who are not even progressives, who want to work with the supporters of the state of Israel. They're threatening to force them to resign. So they're willing to destroy higher education in the United States in order to maintain unconditional support for the state of Israel. It's totally outrageous. It's irrational, and it's going to prove to be a detriment to young people throughout the United States.
I know I said that was my final question, but I have to squeeze this one last question, which is a message to some of those Western do-gooders, the ones who say that we need to have humanitarian intervention in Somalia when this happens. We need to support the Tigrayan secessionist forces in Ethiopia, and some of them will use the language of the left, which is like we support
self-determination.
Yeah, self-determination for the people of Tigray. And I'm pretty, and I know, in Canada, I cover a lot of Canadian topics. A lot of the left in Canada and well-meaning folks, they fall for the idea that, well, Canada's military is not engaging in any, in any wrongdoing, and we need to support, peacekeeping, Canadian peacekeeping through the United Nations, so forth. So what would you say to those people? When it comes to, heaven forbid, if another situation breaks out in Somalia or any part of Africa for that matter, or Haiti for that, or Haiti.
Yeah, I think Canada should maintain a position of non-interference in African affairs. And I think also that if they want to engage in peacekeeping operations, they should make sure that they're not designed to the weight is not in favor of U.S. imperialism and world imperialism as a whole. That would be my message to anyone in Canada. And we saw the reaction of the Trudeau government when the situation erupted in Gaza. Initially, it appears as if Justin Trudeau was saying that there was no place in Canada for anybody who was in solidarity with Hamas. Well, that definitely is not the case, because hundreds of thousands of people have come out and demonstrated in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa, and even in Windsor, Ontario, which is right across from Detroit, where I am, in solidarity with Palestine. So obviously there are a lot of people in Canada who do not agree with the policies of the state of Israel, and who have publicly expressed that to mass demonstrations and rallies. So he needs to recalibrate his views on the Palestinian question, move away from the unconditional support to the state of Israel, and demand that Israel stop its genocidal policies against the Palestinians, and that the Palestinians themselves have a right to an independent, sovereign state that, of course, is recognized by the international community.
Yes, and then I think then another final message I would be is join actual anti-imperialist organizations and demand the
Definitely.
U.S. and its allies, AFRICOM out, NATO out, and then
Right.
and also we also need to lobby more for an end to the unjust system of capitalism in Africa, and that's going after the IMF, the World Bank, and so forth, because they all play a part in why the continent continues to be impoverished, and why there is oftentimes civil wars, which don't just fall out of the sky; they're exploited by the West and its Gulf allies, right?
Yeah, people need to read like Kwame Nkrumah's book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, written in 1965, which outlines, the way in which U.S. imperialism dominates and controls the economy and the politics and the military affairs of the African continent. And of course, there are other great works, Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which he outlines the historical underdevelopment of Africa through the Atlantic slave trade and through colonialism and modern day neocolonialism. So, yes, people need to understand all of those issues, and Africa cannot be free under the current conditions of U.S. hegemony. Uh, the U.S. is losing influence in Africa and throughout the world. That's why they're fighting back so hard at this point to maintain that hegemony.
Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One with Abayomi Azikiwe, who is the editor of Pan-African Newswire. And again, you can also find his writings on on all sorts of African topics at Black Agenda Report, workersworld.org, News Ghana, Janata Weekly, globalresearch.ca, Hood Communism. And if you go on YouTube, you can find him on, at Press TV, CGTN, Al Jazeera, WBI, Pacifica, and others. Abayomi, thank you so much for teaching us all about Somalia. It's been a real pleasure. And uh, well, it's December, so Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to you.
Same to you.
and
Same to you.
I look forward getting back in touch with you sometime after the holidays, sometime after New Year's, because the next country we're going to learn about is Sudan, and I'm really
All
excited
right.
that you teaching us about that.
Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Likewise.